I woke to the sound of something popping sharp and irregular like corn bursting in a pan. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that the noise came from some half-remembered kitchen years ago. Then the air shifted hot and thick, and the unmistakable scent of smoke wrapped around me. The alarm shrieked. My heart at 72 thumped like a trapped bird. I stumbled from bed bare feet against the cool floorboards, and the hallway was already filling with a haze that blurred the familiar photographs on the walls. The faces of my late husband and my son, framed in wood, seemed to melt behind the smoke. I shouted for help, though I lived alone. My voice sounded thin against the crackle that now roared from the living room. Instinct drove me shoes by the door purse from the counter, the suitcase I had kept half-packed ever since the storm last winter. My hands trembled as I pulled it open and shoved in what I could reach: 2 dresses. The sweater my husband once said made me look like spring. The fireproof box sat at the back of my closet, heavy but small. I'd always told myself it was precaution, a librarian's habit of cataloging, preserving. Now it was my salvation. I grabbed it with both arms, coughing as the smoke thickened. By the time I reached the front porch, the air outside felt like ice against my face. Neighbors gathered in their robes, pointing, murmuring. Someone had already called the fire department, and I heard the distant wail of sirens. I turned back just once. The flames licked the curtains, swallowing the window panes, painting the night in orange. The firefighters rushed in with hoses and shouted orders, but I knew. Years of memories, Christmas mornings, birthdays, even the quiet evenings reading alone, all of it was being eaten alive. My knees gave way, and I sat on the curb clutching the box against my chest like a child with a toy. One neighbor draped a blanket over my shoulders. I couldn't feel its warmth. I watched the firemen battle saw water arc through the air, heard the wood splintering under pressure. My mind kept repeating, "This is my house. My house." Hours passed, though time had no shape in the smoke and flashing lights. At last, one of the men removed his helmet and approached me. His eyes, tired but kind, said everything before his words did. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. It's a total loss." I nodded. What else could I do? I had no husband to lean on, no daughter to cry with. Just Thomas, my son. But he was across town and it was past midnight. I told myself he would understand if I appeared at his door. He would remember the nights I stayed awake with him when he was sick, the sacrifices no one saw. The firefighters packed up. The crowd thinned. I stood on unsteady legs, clutching my suitcase and the box, and turned toward my car parked at the edge of the street. Its headlights reflected off the wet pavement, waiting like the last lifeboat after a shipwreck. I slid into the driver's seat, the smell of smoke clinging to my hair, my clothes, my skin. My hands shook as I placed the box carefully on the passenger side. Inside were the fragments of a life, documents, a few letters, perhaps the last proof that I had existed before tonight. I started the engine. The rearview mirror showed the glow of the fire still devouring the skeleton of my home. I didn't look again. I pressed the accelerator and guided the car slowly into the dark road ahead. By the time the sirens faded behind me, I had decided where to go. I was driving to my son's house. The road stretched out before me, dark and endless, lit only by the beams of my aging headlights. I gripped the wheel tighter than I meant to, the smoke still clinging to my throat. The hum of the engine was steady, almost soothing, and yet each mile carried me farther from the house that had been my anchor for nearly 5 decades. I thought of Thomas as I drove. My boy. My only child. When his father passed, Thomas had just turned 14, lanky and sullen, too young to understand the weight that landed on my shoulders. I remembered sitting him down at the kitchen table, explaining that things would be different now. His eyes had filled with tears, and I promised him I would do everything I could to make sure he never felt the loss more than he already did. And I kept that promise. I sold the little patch of land my parents had left me land. I had dreamed of turning into a small garden retreat when I grew old. The money went straight into tuition braces and the endless stream of sneakers he outgrew too fast. Every time I signed away something of mine, I told myself it was an investment in him. The wipers screeched across the windshield as mist began to fall. My thoughts traveled further back to the nights I worked extra shifts at the library closing stacks, while Thomas slept at Grace's house because I couldn't get home in time. To the mornings, I packed lunches stretching soup and bread so he wouldn't notice how little I ate. To the times I stood in the bleachers at his high school games, clapping until my hands burned, making sure he knew I was there. All of it, every sacrifice seemed worth it when he crossed the stage at graduation diploma in hand. I cried so hard that day I had to hide behind my sunglasses. I thought his future would shine brighter than mine ever had. That was the point, wasn't it? To give your child a better start than you were given. The highway lights blurred, and I blinked hard to stay focused. The clock on the dash glowed past 1 in the morning. My chest ached with a mixture of fatigue and fear. But I pushed on. I told myself Thomas would open his door without hesitation, that he would remember every hour I stood in his corner. When he married Vanessa, I tried to be gracious. She was confident, polished, and always seemed slightly impatient with me, as if I spoke a language she barely understood. I swallowed it down, telling myself my son's happiness was what mattered. I even let them move into my home once years ago when Thomas lost his job. I never asked for rent. I cooked meals, folded laundry, and tiptoed around their quarrels until he was back on his feet. As I drove now, those memories returned sharper, heavier. I told myself he wouldn't forget, that when I knocked on his door with smoke still in my hair suitcase in hand, he would see not just a weary old woman, but the mother who carried him through storms. The town lights came into view as I turned off the highway, winding through familiar streets that felt foreign in the haze of night. My heart thudded harder with each block. His house wasn't far. Now the porch light usually left on like a beacon. I slowed as I turned onto his street, recognizing the neat row of trimmed lawns and tidy mailboxes. My headlights swept across the driveway, where his car sat silent and still. I pulled up at the curb, cut the engine, and sat in the quiet, my hands trembling against the wheel. My chest rose and fell with the weight of what I was about to ask. Not charity, not pity, but shelter. Just for a little while. I lifted the suitcase from the back seat, pressed the fireproof box to my chest, and stepped out into the night air. I was at my son's door. I rang the bell and waited, the weight of the suitcase tugging at my arm. For a moment, I thought maybe no one would hear it. Then the door swung open, and there she was, Vanessa framed in the light of the hallway, her silk robe cinched neatly at the waist. Her eyes flicked from the smoke-stained box in my arms to my soot-marked sweater. Her lips pressed into a line that wasn't quite surprise and certainly not welcome. "Eleanor," she said my name flat, like a duty she had to get through. "It's late." I know, I answered quickly, my throat tight. "There was a fire. The house is gone." I didn't know where else to go. Behind her, I saw Thomas appear, rubbing his eyes. His hair mussed. He froze when he saw me, then glanced at Vanessa. "Mom." His voice cracked with something I wanted to call concern, though it was small and uncertain. "I just need a place for tonight," I said softly, "until I can figure things out." The silence stretched. Vanessa sighed almost imperceptibly and pulled the door wider. "Fine. Come in." I stepped inside, the warmth of their home wrapping around me, though it felt more like heat than comfort. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and Vanessa's perfume. I set my suitcase down carefully near the entryway, feeling suddenly like an intruder in a house I had once opened freely for them. Thomas cleared his throat. "Do you want something to eat, Mom?" I shook my head. "No, thank you. I'm just tired." But Vanessa was already moving toward the kitchen. I heard cabinets opening, plates clinking, her movements brisk, impatient. Minutes later, she returned, setting a plate of reheated casserole in front of me at the dining table. "Eat," she said, as if issuing an order rather than an invitation. I picked up the fork, though my stomach twisted. The three of us sat there, the only sound the scrape of metal against porcelain. Thomas tried now and then to start small talk about work, about the weather, but each attempt died quickly snuffed out by Vanessa's silence or her curt replies. I studied their faces in the glow of the overhead light. Thomas looked weary, older than his 42 years, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight he couldn't put down. Vanessa's gaze darted everywhere, but me, her nails, her phone, the clock on the wall. I forced myself to swallow a few bites, each one tasting more like ash than the smoke still clinging to me. My chest tightened with the realization that I wasn't just tired from the fire. I was unwelcome. I remembered the nights years ago when they lived under my roof, when I cooked for them, folded their laundry, and gave them space until Thomas found steady work again. I hadn't thought of it as charity. It was love, the kind a mother doesn't question. Now, sitting at their table, I wondered if any of it had meant the same to them. After a few minutes, I set down my fork. "Thank you," I murmured, though the words felt heavy on my tongue. Thomas gave me a weak smile, but Vanessa only nodded, once her face unreadable. The silence grew unbearable, pressing down like the smoke in my lungs earlier that night. I sat with it until I couldn't anymore, until I understood that the fire had taken my house. But this house would not be my refuge. And then Vanessa's patience broke. I kept my eyes on the plate in front of me, trying to will the food into tasting like something other than cardboard. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the fork again. Across from me, Thomas stared down at his meal as though it held answers he couldn't face. Vanessa's phone buzzed on the table, and she snatched it up, scrolling while I chewed in silence. The clink of my fork against the plate seemed louder than it should have been. Finally, I set it down. "I don't want to impose," I began, my voice low. "I just need a few nights to figure out where I can go. The fire. That's the problem, Eleanor." Vanessa's voice sliced through mine. Her eyes snapped up from her phone, sharp and cold. "It's always a few nights, a few weeks, a few months, and then suddenly you're just here, taking up space." My chest tightened. "I had nowhere else to go," I said softly. "And that somehow becomes our responsibility." She shot back, her words quick, practiced. "Thomas works long hours. I manage this house. We already have enough stress without adding." She gestured at me with both hands. "This." I looked to Thomas, waiting for him to speak, to push back against her tone, to remind her that I wasn't a burden, but his mother. He shifted in his chair, cleared his throat, then lowered his eyes again. Vanessa pressed on, her voice rising with each word. "You think you can just show up in the middle of the night, suitcase in hand, and everything will bend to you? No, Eleanor. That's not how this works. This is my house, my rules." Something hot flared inside me. "Your house," I repeated before I could stop myself. "You wouldn't even be living here if..." "Don't," she snapped, slamming her palm against the table hard enough to rattle the plates. "Don't you dare bring up the past as if it gives you rights here. This is my home now, not yours. And I won't let you sit at my table and act like some queen we should serve." The words hit harder than the crack of her hand. I glanced again at Thomas, silently begging him to say something, anything. His jaw flexed. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. Vanessa leaned closer, her voice dripping with disdain. "You need to get out, Eleanor. Pack up whatever pity you came here with and leave. I'm not your caretaker. I'm not your maid. I don't want you here." The room spun for a moment. My throat burned, not just from the smoke still clinging to me, but from humiliation. I thought of all the nights I stayed awake rocking Thomas when he had fevers. The years I worked 2 jobs to keep him clothed, to keep food on the table. The afternoons I cheered in the bleachers when no one else came. And now here I sat, told to leave by the woman who wore the title of daughter-in-law, but never earned the place of family. My chair scraped softly against the tile as I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. My dignity felt cracked, but I held onto the shards tightly enough to keep me upright. Thank you for the meal I managed. My eyes lingered on Thomas. He still wouldn't look at me. The silence between us was louder than any scream. I picked up my suitcase from the entryway and hugged the fireproof box against my chest. My legs carried me to the door before the weight of what had just happened could crush me completely. The night air outside was cold, sharper than before. I stepped onto the porch, closed the door behind me, and walked down the path alone. I didn't know where I was going, only that it couldn't be here. The streetlights blurred as I drove with no destination, the suitcase rattling quietly in the back seat, the fireproof box heavy on the passenger side. I didn't cry, not yet. The shock was too fresh, like a burn that hadn't blistered. My son's silence replayed in my ears louder than Vanessa's words. I pulled into the empty lot of a 24-hour supermarket. The building loomed against the dark, its neon sign buzzing faintly. A scattering of cars sat abandoned at the edges, but the center of the lot was wide open. I parked beneath a flickering light, turned off the engine, and listened to the sudden silence. The cold crept in quickly. I wrapped my coat tighter, though it smelled of smoke, sharp and bitter. I rested my head against the steering wheel, the leather worn smooth by years of use. For the first time, the weight of everything landed fully on me. My house was ash. My son's door had closed, and I had nowhere to belong. David? I whispered into the dark. My husband's name. It felt strange on my tongue after so many years of speaking it only in memory. If you can hear me, I could use your strength tonight. The quiet answered back, but I kept talking. I told him about the fire, about the smoke pouring through the windows, about how I clutched the box like a lifeline. I told him how Thomas had looked at his plate instead of at me, how his wife's words had cut sharper than any flame. "You'd have spoken," I murmured. "Even if you were afraid, you'd never have let me walk out like that." I closed my eyes, picturing him as he was broad-shouldered, quick to laugh, steady in storms. I wondered what he would say if he saw me now, shivering in a parking lot, a 72-year-old woman with no bed to call her own. The minutes dragged. I tried to doze, but each time my head slipped sideways, the stiffness of the seat jolted me awake. The lot grew quieter as the hours deepened. The flickering light above me hummed, then buzzed, then steadied again. At some point, exhaustion overtook me. My breath fogged the windows, and I drew a shaky heart in the condensation. With my finger, an old habit I used to do for Thomas when he was a child riding in the back seat. Seeing it fade away felt like watching my life disappear piece by piece. The cold woke me just before dawn. My back ached. My mouth was dry, and for a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. Then it came rushing back, the fire, the shouting, the silence. I sat up straighter, gripping the steering wheel, and told myself I wouldn't let this become permanent. Still, the ache in my chest lingered. Homelessness wasn't just losing a roof. It was losing the certainty that you belonged somewhere. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine coughing before settling into a steady rumble. The rising sun painted the edge of the horizon in pale pink. I didn't know exactly where I'd head, but I knew I couldn't face another night like this. So, I drove back toward the part of town where an old friend lived. I drove on instinct, the streets familiar yet strange in the dim morning light. The exhaustion weighed heavy, every red light daring me to close my eyes and never open them again. But my hands stayed clenched on the wheel, steering toward a neighborhood I hadn't visited in months. Grace lived near the edge of town, in the same modest house she and her husband had bought 40 years ago. He was gone now, like David, but Grace had stayed planting her garden each spring, as if time hadn't dared touch her. When I pulled up outside, the curtains in her front window were already parted, a lamp glowing inside. She had always been an early riser. I sat in the car a long moment, debating whether to disturb her, whether to let her see me in this state. Hair singed at the ends, clothes stained with smoke suitcase on the seat beside me, like a badge of failure. I nearly turned the key to drive away when the front door opened. Grace stepped out, sweater draped over her shoulders, and peered toward the street. When she recognized me, her hand flew to her mouth. "Eleanor," she called, her voice cracking. I climbed out slowly, holding the fireproof box close to my chest. My throat tightened. "I didn't want to wake you. I didn't know where else to go." Grace hurried down the steps, her slippers slapping against the concrete. She didn't hesitate. Her arms went around me, pulling me close, and for the first time since the fire, I let myself lean into someone's strength. "What happened?" she whispered. "The house is gone." I managed, my voice breaking. "And Thomas, Vanessa, I couldn't stay there." She pulled back just enough to look at me, her eyes flashing with something between anger and heartbreak. "Come inside." Now. I followed her into the warmth of her home, the familiar scent of cinnamon and old books wrapping around me like a quilt. She led me to the kitchen, sat me down, and poured hot coffee before I could protest. "You're shaking," she said, sliding the mug into my hands. "Drink." The steam rose, fogging my glasses, but the heat grounded me. I took a sip, the bitter taste steadying my nerves. "I didn't want to trouble you, Grace. You've got your own life." Her laugh was sharp, almost scolding. "Trouble me, Eleanor. We grew up braiding each other's hair on the playground. We raised our boys side by side. If you can't come to me now, then what was all of that for?" The shame in my chest softened, replaced by something warmer. I nodded, unable to speak. She reached across the table, her hand closing firmly over mine. "Stay here as long as you need. I won't hear another word against it." Tears blurred my vision. Gratitude swelled so hard, it hurt. I wanted to argue, to insist I'd find my own way, but the truth was clear, I had nowhere else. I lifted the mug again, holding it steady this time, and whispered, "Thank you." Grace squeezed my hand tighter. "You're not alone, Eleanor. Not while I'm still breathing." For the first time since the flames consumed my house, I felt the faintest flicker of safety return. That night in her guest room, I set the fireproof box beside the bed. I didn't open it yet, but I knew soon I would. Grace's guest room was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until every small sound feels magnified. The tick of her wall clock, the creak of pipes settling, even my own breathing seemed louder than usual. I lay awake long after she had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind chasing itself in circles. Beside me on the floor sat the fireproof box, black and scuffed from being dragged through smoke. I'd kept it for years, always tucked away in the closet, always telling myself I would never need it. Now it was the only thing I had carried from the ruins. The longer I stared at it, the heavier it felt, as though the box itself knew I had been avoiding what lay inside. Finally, unable to stand the waiting, I slid to the floor, pulled it close, and turned the small key that dangled from the chain around my neck. The lock clicked open with a sound too casual for something that suddenly felt so grave. I lifted the lid. Inside lay the fragments of a life-preserved yellowed envelopes with my name written in David's handwriting, brittle photographs of Thomas as a boy, a bundle of certificates and insurance forms. The smell of old paper, faintly sweet, rose up like a ghost. My fingers trembled as I unfolded one of David's letters, written during his last year when illness kept him home. His script was strong despite the pain. "If anything happens, promise me you'll hold on to the house. It's the one place that carries us both." The words blurred through my tears. I pressed the letter to my lips, closing my eyes, and for a moment, I felt his presence in the room. Beneath the letters wrapped in plastic was the property deed. My breath caught when I saw the bold print, Eleanor Hayes, sole owner. The document was dated nearly 30 years back, never amended, never transferred. I sat frozen, reading it again and again as if the words might change with each pass. But they didn't. The truth stared back at me. The house where Thomas and Vanessa lived wasn't theirs at all. It was mine. Shock rippled through me, followed quickly by a strange, guilty relief. I had assumed years ago that Thomas had taken over the title when he and Vanessa moved in. I thought my role had quietly ended the moment I let them make it their home, but no. The law at least still recognized me as the rightful owner. I leaned back against the bed frame deed in one hand, David's letter in the other. Memories crowded in Thomas as a boy running barefoot through the hallway. Vanessa's tight smile the first time she crossed the threshold, the countless holidays I hosted, never asking for more than a thank you. How easily I had given without keeping track. And now all those years of generosity felt like a noose tightening around me. They believed the house was theirs. They spoke to me as if I were a guest. Vanessa called it her house without hesitation. And all the while, the deed sat quietly in my box, waiting to remind me of what was true. I placed the papers back carefully, locking the box again, though my heart kept racing. The knowledge sat heavy inside me, sharper than any weapon I had ever held. Grace knocked gently the next morning, bringing tea. She glanced at the box still by my bed. "Find anything?" she asked softly. I nodded. The words failed me. I couldn't yet tell her the whole of it, not until I had decided what to do. Because now I knew something Thomas and Vanessa did not. And sooner or later, they would. Here's Chapter 8 in full prose. 620 words, first person, flowing directly from Chapter 7. I carried the box with me to the kitchen table long after Grace had left for her morning walk. The weight of the deed seemed heavier than the paper it was printed on, pulling my thoughts backward through time. I remembered the first time Thomas came to me after losing his job. He was 27, recently married, his confidence stripped away by a layoff he never saw coming. He stood in my doorway that night, shoulders sagging, Vanessa hovering at his side. She looked polished, her blouse crisp, but her eyes were restless, darting around my living room as though already measuring the space. Just for a little while, Thomas had said, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. "Until I get back on my feet." I didn't hesitate. Of course I told him. "This is your home too." I opened the spare bedroom, dusted the dresser, and made space in the closet. Vanessa filled it within hours, her shoes lined neatly in rows, her clothes draped on hangers like ornaments. I pretended not to notice the way she sighed when she brushed past my floral wallpaper, or the way she rearranged my dishes in the kitchen without asking. At first, it wasn't hard. I cooked dinners, left notes of encouragement on the counter, tried to soften Thomas's disappointment with humor. I reminded him of the boy who once built a fort in the backyard out of nothing but cardboard boxes, convinced he could defend the world. That spark, I told him, was still there. But weeks turned to months. He took odd jobs, came home late, and each night, Vanessa's patience wore thinner. I overheard her once in the hallway, her voice sharp as glass. "We can't live like this forever, Thomas. I didn't marry you to play house in your mother's charity." I froze in my bedroom, heart aching. I wanted to storm out to remind her that without me, they wouldn't have had a roof at all. But instead, I stayed silent, pressing my palms against the quilt David and I had bought years earlier. Silence felt safer than confrontation. I never asked them for rent. Not a single bill. I told myself it was because I wanted Thomas to rebuild without extra burdens. I convinced myself that generosity was the glue holding us together. But generosity, I would later learn, can become invisible if given too freely. It turns into expectation, into entitlement. The day Thomas finally landed a steady job again, I baked his favorite pie. I watched him walk in the door, briefcase in hand, Vanessa trailing behind, with a smile that looked more like triumph than relief. We sat around the table, and I waited for gratitude, for recognition of the months I had carried them. Instead, Vanessa raised her glass and said, "To new beginnings, our home at last." Her words stung, though I swallowed the bitterness with my pie. They moved out within weeks, renting a sleek apartment across town. My house grew quiet again, and I convinced myself the silence was worth the cost. Now, sitting at Grace's table with the deed in front of me, the memory felt different. It wasn't just a chapter of kindness. It was the beginning of a pattern. I had given, they had taken, and somewhere along the way, what was mine had become what they believed was theirs. I traced my finger over David's letter again, his handwriting steady and sure. Hold on to the house. He had known something I hadn't yet learned, that sometimes the people you love most will mistake your sacrifice for weakness. And now, with the deed in my possession, I realized the moment had come to decide which it truly was. Grace returned just then, brushing leaves from her sweater, and caught me staring at the papers. I closed the box carefully, my mind already racing toward the choice I could no longer avoid. The deed stayed on the table for 2 days, its edges peeking out from beneath the stack of David's letters. I couldn't seem to put it away, though I couldn't quite bear to act on it either. Each time I passed by, I felt the weight of the decision pressing down on me, one path leading to confrontation, the other to silence that had already cost me too much. Grace noticed. She always did. On the third morning, she came into the kitchen with her hair still damp from her shower, saw me staring at the papers, and sighed. "You're torturing yourself," she said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "It's not the deed that's heavy, Eleanor. It's what you keep trying not to see." I looked up, startled by the sharpness in her voice. "I don't want to make things worse," I whispered. "They're my family." Grace slid my coffee across the table. "Family doesn't mean letting people walk over you. Respect isn't given, it's reclaimed. You taught me that when we were girls. Remember." Her words struck a chord. I remembered a younger version of myself standing tall, even when money was short, when David was sick, when I had no one to lean on but my own strength. Somewhere along the way, I had mistaken endurance for peace, as if biting my tongue could keep a family whole. I rubbed the rim of the mug with my thumb. "If I tell them, if I use this deed, then they'll finally see you," Grace said firmly. "Not the quiet woman they think they can dismiss, but the mother who built the life they live in, the woman who still owns the ground they're standing on." Her conviction frightened me almost as much as it comforted me. The idea of facing Vanessa's scorn and Thomas's silence made my stomach twist. But a deeper fear pulsed beneath it, that if I did nothing, I would disappear completely, erased from the very place David had sworn would always carry us both. That night, lying in the guest bed, I stared at the ceiling until my eyes ached. I thought of the fire of Vanessa's voice telling me to get out of Thomas, keeping his head bowed instead of meeting my eyes. I thought of David's letter. The ink faded, but the words clear. Hold on to the house. By the time dawn crept through the curtains, my mind was no longer circling. It was steady. Grace was right. Silence had been my shield, but it had also been my undoing. I rose, walked back to the kitchen, and opened the fireproof box again. My fingers lingered on the deed, tracing my name where it was printed, bold and undeniable. The decision was no longer a question. I would reclaim what was mine. The next step was finding someone who could help me do it right. Grace insisted on coming with me, though. I told her she didn't have to. "Nonsense," she said, slipping on her coat. "You don't walk into things like this alone anymore." The office of Whitford and Reed was small, tucked between a bakery and an insurance agency on Main Street. A bell jingled when we stepped inside, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air. The receptionist glanced up, greeted us kindly, and ushered us into a narrow office lined with books. Clara Whitford couldn't have been more than her mid-30s. She rose from behind her desk, extended a hand, and smiled in a way that managed to be both professional and warm. Her dark hair was tied neatly back, and her eyes were quick, curious. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "I understand you'd like me to review some documents." My hands trembled slightly as I set the fireproof box on her desk and pulled out the deed. She took it gently, spreading it across a folder with the care of someone who understood the gravity of paper. She read in silence, her brow furrowing slightly as her pen tapped against the desk. I felt my pulse thud in my ears. Is it valid?" Clara looked up. "Yes, more than valid. This deed is clear, Mrs. Hayes. You are listed as the sole and current owner of the property. There are no amendments, no transfers, no liens. It is yours outright." Her certainty knocked the air from my lungs. For weeks I had doubted myself, wondered if perhaps I had misunderstood, if some paperwork long forgotten had changed things. But here it was, confirmed by the law itself. Grace squeezed my hand, her grip firm, as if to say, "I told you so." Clara leaned forward. "Tell me what's happening," I explained haltingly. "The fire the night at my son's house." Vanessa's words. Thomas's silence. Clara listened without interruption, her face calm but her eyes narrowing with each detail. When I finished, she folded her hands. "Then here's the truth: you don't need their permission to be there. You don't need to beg for space in your own home. Legally, you hold all rights to that property. If they're living there, it's because you've allowed them to, not because they own it." The words hit me harder than I expected. Permission. Allowance. I had given so much for so long that I hadn't even realized the difference. Clara opened a fresh folder and began sliding papers into it. "What I can do for you is formalize this. We'll draft notice to reassert your ownership. If necessary, we can issue an eviction, but we'll start with documents that make your position undeniable." I swallowed hard. "Eviction. That's my son." Her voice softened. "I understand. That's why we'll proceed carefully. But Mrs. Hayes, you need to protect yourself. This deed is more than paper, it's your security. Don't let them use your silence to erase it." I nodded slowly. The weight of the decision pressed against me, but for the first time in months, I felt something stronger than fear, clarity. Clara slid the deed back toward me, placing her hand briefly over mine. "This is yours. All we're doing is making sure everyone remembers it." Grace exhaled beside me, and I realized she had been holding her breath. When we left the office, the air outside felt crisper, the winter sun sharper against the sky. I clutched the folder Clara had prepared, its edges digging into my palm like a reminder. The law was on my side, and soon Thomas and Vanessa would have to face that truth. A week after my meeting with Clara, I drove past my house. I hadn't intended to stop. The plan had been to circle the block once to see it standing there, to remind myself that it was still mine in more than memory. But when I turned the corner and saw Thomas's car in the driveway, I slowed. The curtains glowed warmly from inside a scene of life I no longer belonged to. My heart tugged me forward. I parked down the street, telling myself I only wanted one glimpse, nothing more. But as I stepped closer, Voices carried through the crisp evening air. I paused by the hedges that lined the yard. Vanessa's voice sliced through the night, sharp, insistent. "We can't keep living here like this, Thomas. It's old. It's small. You deserve better. We deserve better. If we sell, we'll finally have enough to buy something in Lakeshore Heights. Imagine it, new kitchen space for guests, a community that actually fits us." My stomach tightened. Lakeshore Heights. A gated neighborhood across town, full of homes twice the size and twice the pride. Thomas's reply came softer, weary. "It's my mother's house, Vanessa. Selling it wouldn't feel right." The silence that followed was brittle. Then Vanessa's laughter, low, bitter. "Your mother, Thomas, she abandoned it. She left us to manage everything. We've paid the bills, done the work. She doesn't live here. We do. It's ours, in every way that matters." I pressed my hand against the hedge to steady myself, the cold branches biting my skin. "I don't know," Thomas muttered. "She's been through enough lately." "That fire wasn't our problem," Vanessa shot back. "You saw her dragging in here with her smoke-stained box. Do you want to spend the rest of your life cleaning up after her? Always the son, never the man." Her words hung heavy in the air. I held my breath, waiting for him to defend me, to push back with the conviction I had once known in his voice. Instead, his next words broke me. "Maybe you're right," he said softly. "Maybe it's time." Time. As if my existence were a loose end he needed to cut. The ground seemed to shift beneath me. I pulled back from the hedge, my chest burning the night air, suddenly too thin. I had expected Vanessa's disdain, her eagerness to erase me. But hearing my son bend to her will, hearing his agreement, it was worse than all of Vanessa's contempt combined. I turned quickly, afraid they might hear the crunch of gravel under my shoes, and walked back toward the street. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. The box in Clara's office, the papers she had handed me, they were no longer just proof of ownership. They were the only shield I had left against being erased entirely. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel, my breath coming in short bursts. Betrayal. The word echoed inside me like a bell. I had carried Thomas through sickness, through loss, through failures and new starts. I had poured myself into his future, believing that love given freely would return freely. But now I knew love without boundaries turns into something else. Something that can be traded away with a sigh and a nod. When the house lights dimmed behind me, I started the engine and pulled away. My reflection in the rearview mirror looked older than I remembered, eyes shadowed by disappointment. Yet beneath the hurt, a quiet resolve began to form. I could not count on Thomas to defend me. I could not rely on him to honor the past. If I wanted to keep my place in this world, my home, my dignity, I would have to fight for it myself. The folder Clara had prepared still sat on Grace's kitchen table, waiting. The morning after I heard Thomas's words, I could barely bring myself to move. Grace found me at the kitchen table, my hands curled around a mug of cold coffee, the steam long gone. I told her everything, the hedge, the voices, the way Vanessa's ambition had poured poison into my son's ear, until he finally nodded along. Grace listened without interrupting, her eyes sharp with anger. When I finished, she placed her hand over mine. "Then you know what you have to do. It's time." Her certainty steadied me enough to reach for Clara's folder. Inside were the documents she had prepared, each page crisp and final, each line spelling out what was already true. I owned the house. I had always owned it. But until now, I had let silence cover the truth like dust. I called Clara that afternoon. She answered on the first ring, her voice calm, efficient. I explained what I had overheard, how Thomas was considering selling. "Then we act now," she said. "I'll file the notices today. Legally, you can reclaim full control immediately." Her confidence should have been comforting, but something in me hesitated. I pictured the scene if I simply appeared at the door with sheriff's papers, Vanessa shrieking, Thomas standing hollow-eyed behind her. Victory maybe, but a hollow one. The shame would roll off them, not stick. No, I said slowly. Not yet. Clara paused. Mrs. Hayes, if you wait, they could try to list the house. That complicates things. I don't mean forever, I answered. But if I do this quietly behind closed doors, Vanessa will spin it as cruelty. She'll say I turned them out without warning, without heart. I want the truth to stand on its own. I want everyone to see it. Clara's tone softened. Then we'll prepare everything now. You'll be protected on paper even if you don't serve it yet. When the moment comes, you'll be ready. Relief washed over me. This wasn't just about reclaiming wood and brick. It was about reclaiming my dignity. And dignity, I realized, deserved more than a private transaction. It deserved light. Over the next week, I met Clara twice more. She walked me through the documents, explained each step of enforcement, and reassured me that nothing could move forward without my signature. You hold the pen, she reminded me. No one else. At night, back in Grace's guest room, I would lie awake, replaying the sound of Vanessa's voice, her laughter, her dismissal. I thought of Thomas's silence, how easily he had agreed. Each time the sting returned, but so did my resolve. I began to imagine the moment, not anger, not shouting, but quiet truth, dropped like a stone into water rippling outward, until the whole room stilled. Vanessa thrived on performance, on twisting stories into her favor. If I confronted her alone, she'd twist mine too. But if I waited until she performed for others, until her arrogance was on full display, then the truth would strip her mask without me raising my voice. The thought gave me strength. I no longer felt like the woman trembling outside her own son's house. I felt steady like David must have when he signed the deed into my name all those years ago. By the time Clara handed me the final folder, neatly bound, I was ready. I slid it into the fireproof box, pressed the lid closed, and locked it again. The house would not be sold. The truth would not be erased. I would wait. And when the moment came, I would not whisper. I would let the silence speak for me. Because silence wielded at the right time can be louder than any scream. And Vanessa's day was coming. It was Grace who told me first. Her niece had mentioned a gathering, something about Vanessa hosting a grand evening at the house. The words made my stomach twist. The house. My house. And yet I wasn't surprised. Vanessa had always been hungry for an audience, and the walls I had once filled with birthday songs and Christmas hymns now served as her stage. Against my better judgment, I went. I told myself it was to watch, to listen, to see for myself what my silence had allowed. The driveway overflowed with polished cars, the porch lit with lanterns I'd never chosen. Music pulsed faintly from inside laughter, spilling into the night air. I stepped through the door and was met with a sheen of glittering light. Chandeliers blazed above, polished to perfection. The furniture had been rearranged, sleek new chairs, replacing the ones David and I had chosen together. Everywhere I looked, I saw fragments of my past, dressed up as Vanessa's present. Guests mingled through the rooms, sipping wine, voices raised in cheerful conversation. At the center of it all stood Vanessa, radiant in a deep red dress, her glass lifted high as she spoke to a cluster of relatives and neighbors. And of course, it's been such work managing this place, she was saying, her laugh smooth and easy. But Thomas and I have made it our own. I take pride in running this home. It's not easy, but it's worth it. The crowd nodded, admiring, as if she were some benevolent hostess rather than a tenant playing queen. I stood near the back, unnoticed, clutching my coat around me. A few glanced my way, their smiles polite, but puzzled, as if wondering why I was there at all. I caught a whisper. "That's Thomas's mother, isn't it?" Followed by a shrug. Thomas eventually appeared at Vanessa's side, smiling faintly, his tie slightly askew. He looked tired, though he laughed when Vanessa nudged him. When his eyes met mine across the room, he froze for a second. Then he looked away, pretending to fuss with a wine glass. The dismissal stung more than Vanessa's performance. As the evening wore on, I found myself pushed further to the margins. Vanessa floated from group to group, her hand brushing Thomas's arm as she introduced him as my husband, the man of the house. She never once acknowledged me. Once when a guest asked about the history of the home, Vanessa waved vaguely. "Oh, it's been in the family, but it's ours now. Ours." The word rang in my head like a bell. I wandered into the dining room, where the long table gleamed under soft light. I had polished that very wood with David countless times, preparing for Thanksgivings that stretched late into the night. Now, place settings glittered with silver I had never owned. My reflection shone faintly in the polished surface, older, smaller, but steadier than I felt. One guest, an old neighbor, stopped me gently. "It's good to see you here, Eleanor." He said, his tone kind but uncertain. His eyes flicked toward Vanessa, before settling back on me. It must be strange. I only nodded. Strange wasn't the word. It was theft wrapped in laughter erasure paraded as elegance. As the party swelled, Vanessa's voice carried again. "A home is what you make of it, don't you think? And I've worked hard to make this one truly ours." Her eyes landed on me just then, a flicker of disdain crossing her face before she turned back to her audience, smiling sweetly. I stood there, invisible and humiliated. But inside me, something shifted. The folder Clara had given me weighed in my memory like a stone. My time was coming. I slipped back into the hall, moving toward the room where I would finally let the truth be heard. The hum of voices swelled around me, glasses clinking, laughter spilling into every corner. Vanessa stood in the center of the living room, her red dress catching the light, as though she had been waiting her whole life for this performance. She raised her glass again, her smile wide, her words carrying clearly above the chatter. To new chapters, she declared, her eyes sweeping the crowd. To building a life in a house we are proud to call our own. The guests responded with a chorus of approval. My throat tightened. Each phrase she spoke was another theft, another brick stolen from the foundation of my life. I stepped forward before I could lose my nerve. The folder in my bag felt heavy each step, pulling me closer to the choice I had been circling for weeks. Conversations quieted as people noticed me move toward the center. Vanessa glanced over her smile, faltering just a fraction, then returned brighter than ever. "Eleanor," she said smoothly, voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm glad you could join us. Please make yourself comfortable." "Can someone get her a seat?" I shook my head. "No need. I won't be long." My voice carried more firmly than I expected. The room hushed, a ripple of silence spreading until only the faint notes of background music played. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope Clara had prepared. Vanessa's smile stiffened. "What's this?" I held it up so everyone could see. "Something that belongs here more than I do, apparently. The truth." I placed the envelope on the polished table and slid it forward. Thomas's eyes followed it, wide and uncertain. Slowly, carefully, I pulled the deed free, the paper crisp beneath my fingers. "This house," I said, my voice steady, "was never yours. It was never handed over, never sold, never gifted. It has always been mine. And here's the proof." Gasps rose around the room, sharp intakes of breath that seemed to echo against the walls. Guests craned their necks, some whispering, others staring outright at Vanessa. Vanessa's cheeks flushed crimson, though her lips still twisted into a brittle smile. "This is absurd," she snapped, the veneer cracking. You can't just show up. And Thomas reached for the paper, scanning the bold print of my name. His hands shook. He looked at me, then at Vanessa, and for once, words failed him completely. I didn't need his defense anymore. The deed spoke louder than any silence he could offer. One of the neighbors leaned closer, murmuring, "Her name's right there." Another guest muttered, "All this time." The whispers spread like wildfire, burning through the glossy image Vanessa had built. Vanessa tried to laugh, but it came out brittle sharp. "So what? She hasn't lived here in years. We've cared for this place. Everyone knows no." I cut in my voice low but firm. "Everyone assumed. There's a difference. And assumptions don't change the truth." The words hung heavy in the stillness. Vanessa's eyes darted from face to face, looking for someone to rescue her, to nod along, to dismiss me. No one moved. I gathered the papers back into the envelope, sliding them neatly inside. "I don't need applause," I said. Quietly, just acknowledgement. This is my home. Always has been. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was damning. I tucked the envelope under my arm, turned toward the stunned crowd, and walked out of the living room. Behind me, the weight of whispers grew louder, pressing against Vanessa like a storm breaking at last. And ahead of me, I knew the moment for the final reckoning had come. The notary cleared his throat, the rustle of papers breaking the heavy quiet. Clara had arranged for him to be present tonight, though most assumed he was simply another guest. Now, standing at the edge of the room with his spectacles low on his nose, he lifted the deed I had placed before him and began to read. This document certifies that the property located at 412 Westfield Lane is under the sole ownership of Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. He said, his voice measured and calm. No amendments, no transfers. Original title intact. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Chairs scraped softly as guests leaned forward, whispering to one another. I watched their eyes shift from me to Vanessa, to Thomas, and back again, trying to make sense of the shift in ground beneath their feet. Vanessa's face drained of color, the red of her dress suddenly too bright against her trembling frame. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice higher than usual. "She's twisting this. Everyone knows we've lived here, we've maintained it." But the notary, unflinching, read on. "All utilities, taxes, and legal responsibilities remain under the authority of Mrs. Hayes, as outlined in the deed filed on June 12, 1988. He lowered the paper and looked squarely at Vanessa. "This is not a matter of opinion, ma'am. It is fact." The murmurs grew louder. A cousin I hadn't seen in years leaned toward another guest, whispering just loud enough for me to catch. "So she really is the owner." Another voice answered. All this time, Vanessa acted like it was hers. Thomas sat frozen, his jaw slack, eyes darting between the deed and his wife. For once, he seemed stripped of his practiced silence, like a boy caught cheating on a test. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, words refusing to come. Vanessa reached for him, fingers digging into his sleeve. "Say something, Thomas," she hissed. But he stayed still, staring at the paper as if it were a mirror reflecting a truth he'd avoided too long. The room seemed to hold its breath. Every guest waited for anyone to speak to, break the tension that pressed against us like a weight. I felt their eyes on me, but I didn't move. The deed had already spoken louder than I ever could. Finally, Vanessa's composure cracked. She stepped forward, her voice trembling with desperation. "She's old. She doesn't understand what this means. She doesn't even live here anymore. You can't just—" The notary cut her off, his tone firm. "Ownership is ownership, Mrs. LeClaire. Residence does not negate title. Unless your husband's mother transfers or sells this property, it remains legally hers." Her mouth fell open, but no words came. The silence that followed wasn't just frozen, It was final. I stood still. The envelope pressed against my side, feeling the strength of the moment settle deep in my bones. Years of sacrifice, years of silence, years of being erased, and here, at last, the truth stood undeniable in front of everyone who had once believed otherwise. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply met Thomas's eyes across the room. He looked away, ashamed, and that was enough. The whispers swelled again, circling Vanessa, until her posture crumpled under them. She trembled, clutching her glass with white knuckles, while Thomas sat rigid beside her, unable to shield her this time. The evening no longer belonged to Vanessa. The house no longer belonged to her story. I gathered the deed back into its envelope, slid it beneath my arm, and walked past the guests, each step quiet but certain. And as I reached the doorway, I knew the time had come to deliver my final word. I stood just inside the doorway, the envelope firm under my arm, the crowd's whispers circling like wind in a storm. Vanessa tried to gather herself, smoothing her dress, but her hands shook too much to hide it. Thomas still hadn't spoken, his eyes on the floor, as though staring hard enough might erase the truth. I let the silence stretch until the only sound was the faint clink of ice melting in glasses. Then, steady and clear, I said, "You have 1 week to leave my house." The words dropped into the room like iron. Vanessa's face twisted. Her breath caught in a shriek. "Leave, you can't be serious. This is our life, our home, everything we've built." "No," I cut in my tone, sharp but quiet. "Everything I built. You've lived here because I allowed it. That ends now." Her scream rattled the chandelier. "You witch! You think you can humiliate me in front of everyone. You think you can just waltz back in here and throw us out." Her fury washed over me like water on stone. For once, it didn't penetrate. I had stood in smoke and ash in parking lots with no roof over my head. I had survived silence sharper than any insult. Vanessa's shouting was only noise. Thomas finally raised his head, his voice breaking. "Mom, please, don't do this. We don't have anywhere else to go right now. Vanessa, she'll fall apart. Can't we work something out?" I looked at him, my son, the boy I once carried through nights of fever, the man who had just agreed to sell me away like a piece of furniture. "You had a choice to defend me," I said, my voice low, heavy with everything unspoken. "You chose silence. You chose her words over my place in this home. You chose to forget who gave you this roof in the first place." His face crumpled, and for a moment, I saw the child he used to be. But pity no longer outweighed truth. "I won't shout," I said louder now so the room could hear. "I don't need to. Respect isn't optional in my house. If you cannot give it, you cannot stay." The guests shifted uncomfortably, but none contradicted me. They had seen enough, heard enough. The weight of the deed, the notary's voice, Vanessa's tantrum, all of it had already drawn the line. Vanessa lunged forward, her hand trembling as she pointed at me. "You'll regret this. Everyone here will see you for what you are, bitter, jealous, pathetic." I didn't flinch. Everyone here just saw the truth. They'll remember who shouted and who stood firm. Her face twisted again, words stumbling, until she fell silent under the weight of the eyes watching her. Thomas put his hand on her arm, but she shook him off violently. The room was thick with tension, but I felt only clarity. I had lived too long with the ache of being dismissed, of biting back words to keep peace. Tonight, peace had nothing to do with silence. Tonight, peace meant drawing a line no one could cross. I stepped back toward the open door, the cool air brushing my skin. 1 week, I repeated, calm as stone. Use it wisely. No one followed me as I left. Behind me, the house buzzed with whispers, Vanessa's sobs breaking into fury again, Thomas's voice faltering. But none of it mattered anymore. The deed was in my hands. The decision was mine. And now, at last, the house would be too. The house was quiet again. Not the brittle silence of being unwelcome, not the choking hush of humiliation, but a gentler kind. The silence of space finally made whole. It had been 3 months since the night I gave them a week to leave. 7 days later, just as I promised, Thomas and Vanessa were gone. They left behind little but dust and a few broken promises. I found their wine glasses still drying on the rack, the faint smell of her perfume clinging to the curtains. For one long afternoon, I walked through each room, sweeping out what remained of them, reclaiming what had always been mine. Restoration didn't happen in a grand sweep. It was small, steady work. I didn't have the money for big renovations, nor did I want them. Instead, I polished what could be saved, painted what needed covering, and let the rest stay imperfect. The house had scars now, but so did I, and we fit each other better for it. Grace came often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with just her presence. She took the seat at my kitchen table David once claimed, her laughter filling the space like sunlight. We would drink coffee in mismatched mugs, the kind Vanessa once sneered at, and we would talk about nothing and everything. It wasn't glamour, but it was honest, and honesty had become my favorite kind of beauty. I brought back small touches of the life I had lost: the quilt David and I had bought for our first winter together, freshly mended. The photos of Thomas as a boy, framed again, though now I looked at them with a more complicated tenderness. I even rehung the wind chime by the back door. On breezy days, its soft notes reminded me that sound could be light, not heavy. The hardest part was accepting Thomas's absence. He called once, weeks after leaving, his voice shaky, full of apologies he couldn't quite form. I listened quietly, then told him the same truth I had spoken that night. Respect isn't optional here. Until he understood that there was nothing more to say. We hung up gently, without anger, but also without reconciliation. At first, I mourned that silence. Then I realized it wasn't emptiness, but space for me to breathe, for me to remember who I was before I tried to buy peace with sacrifice. The community, once so quick to accept Vanessa's performances, shifted quietly after that night. Neighbors began to nod at me again, their glances less pitying, more respectful. I didn't need their validation, but I noticed it all the same. The truth had settled, and it was mine to live with openly. One evening, Grace and I sat at the table sharing pie I had baked from her recipe. She teased me for cutting the slices unevenly, and we laughed until tears blurred our vision. After the laughter faded, I looked around the kitchen, the chipped counter, the old clock ticking steadily, the deed tucked safely in the drawer. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was clinging to what was left. I felt like I had chosen what would remain. I thought I lost everything I told her quietly, surprising myself with the words. But I only lost illusions. What's left is mine, and it's enough. Grace reached across the table, her hand warm over mine. More than enough, she said. That night, as I locked the doors and turned off the lights, I paused in the hallway. The walls no longer felt like they belonged to someone else. They held my breath, my footsteps, my story. The house was home again, and so was I.